The topic, it might sound like a surprising one to come to you from someone who has had a lifetime really in journalism and often writing about quite obscure, quite difficult subjects, especially science and medicine, as a matter of fact, over many years. And I would say that I used to make science my faith, my hope for the future, because I didn't have a very good opinion of religion. It seemed to me to be the cause of so much division and sometimes violence. But I have changed enormously over the years, and the title is aimed at kind of giving the essence of what I've learned, and that I would really like to share with you tonight. And it's also, it wasn't planned this way, but it's very appropriate that it's a title like this has come at Diwali time, because the light that is sometimes just a ritual in Diwali, but it's really is to do with the light of understanding, the light of love, the light of wisdom, and that light gets rekindled in us when we learn how much we're loved by God. But souls and God are not language which is that familiar in the West at any rate. And so I want to sort of tell about how I've gradually understood what this is all about, having been drawn into practicing, meditation and Raja Yoga study, as Ritvik said, some 40 years back. And at that time, feeling that I was experiencing a lot of love, but I didn't really know where it came from. It just felt like some beautiful vibrations. It was, in a way, it was just coming from practiced yogis, I would say. Some of those, some of you may have met some of the daddies who had spent many, many years in India originally, before coming around the world to carry with them the fruits of their internal practice of the relationship with God. And they'd made it so intense that they were able to show us in the West what it felt like to be loved by God. But I didn't really understand that. I just felt these were beautiful vibrations from some beautiful people. And as long as you haven't really got the understanding inside, you don't have the power to do it for yourself. So that's what I want to be sharing something of tonight, to give you a taste of how that shift has happened. We don't hear a lot of talk these days about the soul and God in the mainstream of life, at any rate. What is the soul, and who or what is God? There are many different ideas have been expressed over the centuries, as you all know. And in recent years, many people, including me, have felt science to be a more reliable belief system. It seemed able to tell us how the physical world works, how to turn that to our advantage. It was amazing the way it harnessed electricity. It learned to turn oil into energy to run machines, including tractors. We learned to apply chemicals to farmland to increase yields and kill pests. We even learned how to release the energy inside the atom. So a lot of amazing achievements, and in nearly 100 years, just the past 100 years, these achievements enabled the human population to quadruple. I don't know if you all realize that, but in the 1920s, mid-1920s, it was about 2 billion. And today it's approaching 8 billion. But there's something of a change now happening in our attitudes towards science. It's growing. It's not that widespread yet, but there's an unease that is growing in the population at large, I believe. And there are two reasons. One is a positive reason, one is a negative. And I'll spell out the negative reason that I see first, but you're probably all familiar with it. There's a growing recognition that our cleverness in mastering matter has come at a big price. The planet is overheating through our frenetic activity. The mass extinction of species is a cause of huge concern. The soil is depleting in quality. There's great suffering in the animal kingdom through factory farming. There are poisonous chemicals everywhere. Our bodies contain hundreds of chemicals that should not normally be there. We don't know what they're doing to us, but we do know that there's a lot of ill health associated with that. We're playing with genetic codes, and we have good intentions of fighting inherited illnesses, but this may also bring a danger of bringing new diseases. And there's, of course, the huge canopy of nuclear missiles still hanging over our heads, thousands of them still in place. So this is a downside that people wonder, well, okay, we've got iPhones and anesthetics, great, and we've got Sainsbury's bringing food to us from all over the world, but what about these other trends? So a growing realization that we're paying a big price for this exploitation of matter. On the positive side, I would say, certainly for me, I don't know how widespread this is yet, but certainly for me, there's a lot of evidence now that materialistic science, which is traditional science actually for the last couple of 100 years, it's been maintaining that the whole world has physical basis, and that mind, whatever that might be, is just some phenomenon arising from the complexity of the brain. That is still conventional scientific belief because of this physicalist or materialist model. And there's a huge amount of evidence pointing actually to this being a wrong model. There's a huge amount of evidence pointing to the importance of our thoughts and feelings in giving rise to the world we experience. I first wrote about this back in the 70s. I did a lot of work when I was first writing as a medical and science correspondent at the Daily Mail. I did many articles on the emerging evidence that our thoughts and feelings are very important, central to our health. So if you have persistently positive thoughts and feelings, as long as they're not taking you into cloud cuckoo land so that you get some horrible wake up, they actually really nourish you physically, physiologically. And if you have persistent anger, upset, hatred, jealousy, resentment, these kind of negative emotions act as blocks in your system. And if they continue over long periods, they give rise to ill health. So very clear now, decades on. That was quite new at the time I was writing about it. It's now very clear about how our thoughts and feelings are intimately related to our physical state. But it goes beyond that. There's a very beautiful book about how our thoughts and feelings affect the world around us, and not only our bodies, which is, of course is a very important part of our world, but what happens to us, the kind of events that occur. It was called A Return to Love, and it was by Marianne Williamson, an American writer. And there's a beautiful expression in that actually summarizes in a way a new paradigm that is emerging in science. A paradigm is a kind of mental construct or pattern. As I said, the conventional paradigm is material. Physics is everything. The world came into being through the Big Bang, and then by chance events over billions of years, we end up with the complexity we call life. That's the conventional view to which I used to subscribe. But this new paradigm says, no, consciousness, intelligence is absolutely fundamental in the way the universe functions. And Marianne Williamson summarized the importance of this for us in our everyday life by saying, thought is cause, experience is effect. And if you're not happy with the effects in your life, you have to change the nature of your thinking. It's a profoundly wise saying. If you're not happy with the effects in your life, you have to change the nature of your thinking. And this actually really points the finger back at yourself, instead of the tendency that we have to blame others, our parents, our spouse, our children, our teachers, our circumstances, our politicians. Instead of that, the world, if I want a better world, if I want to make a contribution to a better world, then I have to point the finger within and look at my own thinking. This is something that I was taught from very early on when I became a student with the Spiritual University. And it was quite a hard lesson for me for a while, but it's thoroughly supported now by this new thinking in science. So, to tell you a little bit more about the new science, it's sometimes called post-materialist science. It's sometimes called the consciousness-based paradigm. And it comes partly from quantum theory. It's a branch of physics that originally arose because when scientists were looking at the very, very small, smaller than the atom, they found that some new laws operate there, which many scientists have been arguing for nearly 100 years mean that we have to understand that this world is mental. And I don't mean just mental in that colloquial sense of being off its rocker, being crazy, but it's actually got mind as fundamental in what happens externally. This consciousness-based paradigm argues that very, very strongly, and it's not liked by mainstream science because it turns upside down the way majority of scientists have been thinking for so long, that matter is primary and mind is something that comes from the brain. But really there's no evidence for that, no evidence that consciousness is somehow produced by the brain. Of course, there are connections between the brain and how our consciousness works, but there's no, despite several decades of study, there's no theory whatsoever as to how I, with my awareness and my sense of joy and color and beauty, how that arises from the workings of the chemicals in my brain, the electrical and chemical activity there. No concept whatsoever. But when we look at it the other way round, that I am actually a unit of consciousness, which in the traditional language is the soul. When I understand that I am not my brain, I'm not my body, but I am the soul. I am this eternal unit of consciousness, individuated from some kind of source. When I understand that, it's such a turnaround. It puts me back in the driving seat of my life. And this is what I found in my own experience. I was really, when I didn't understand things this way, but when I was looking for all my happiness from outside of myself, from my success in my work, from my family, etc., it was always elusive, always needed more. Somehow it never worked. But once I have really grasped that I am a soul, and I'll go on to explain how I also understand that I am really loved by God, as we all are. Once that penny dropped, a lot more power came into my life to resist negative tendencies, which have been plenty, and focus on positive thinking about myself and about others. As I said, not hiding from reality, but not dwelling on people's weaknesses. Instead, dwelling on what is good and having a kind of confidence as well that we are taking part in a play that is not the random chance happening that emerged from billions of years of development, and which, how desperate people must feel if they see the possibility of that all ending in some nuclear holocaust. It's not that. It's actually this play that this play that we're in is a scripted drama that has a beginning, a middle, and an end that gives rise to the beginning. This is I'm not going into this tonight, but it's one of the key understandings that has really allowed confidence in the meaning of the eternal soul to grow inside me. Okay, that gives you a bit of a feeling about the soul and how the support from science. What this new paradigm says is that all living creatures have some consciousness, some intelligence, allowing them to do what they do. They don't have to have brains to do this. Even a single-celled creature like an amoeba can learn how to go towards warmth and food. It doesn't have a brain to learn that, but it has its own little spark of consciousness, and it's within that it learns. So this is such a incredibly different from what you're taught most of the science programs on the BBC or elsewhere. This is solid science from some very top people. So these discoveries have been important to me, especially important to me because of my background
5 years old.
Of being a bit of a science worshipper. But science is actually only rediscovering truths that the great faith traditions have long known, though they've often been lost because of power games and problems, in people losing sight of the core of what those faith traditions were out to do, which was to allow us to know ourselves in a deeper way. But Raj Yoga has shown me very clearly the teachings about the soul and God, and I've been following these for some decades, but I now have a much greater conviction about the reality of them. It tells one of the key understandings in this Raj Yoga scheme of things. It tells me that God turns things round for humanity. God is remembered in these faith traditions as doing something good, and sometimes people have felt inspired to do things and for goodness' sake. But my understanding now is that God is more than just an energy of goodness. God is a soul, as I am, but a supreme soul who never loses his truth, who never loses the truth about the human spirit, which he's like the embodiment, the seed of what is highest in us. So we know that as humans, we have a capacity for kindness and love, generosity of spirit, care, many, many positive qualities, but we also know that when we get trapped by limited thinking, we can behave badly towards others, and ultimately that also harms ourselves. That goodness gets covered over with rust if we become too lost in the external world and forget about our divine origin. And that's what's happened, in my understanding now, it's happened to all of us, but to different degrees. With me, to quite a high degree because of all of that sort of materialism. So now that's shifting. What this God does is make it known to us that we are all his children and that we all come from that one. And this is for those unfamiliar with it, it's a kind of rather intangible concept, but imagine that space-time is the 3 dimensions of space and the one of time in which the play operates. Imagine that is really just like a theatre, and there is a home for souls away from that theatre, a non-dimensional space. It's not part of space and time, so it's eternal, and it has no dimensions as we understand it here on the stage. But it's real. It's a kind of place of origin of all of us. And in the understanding that I've learned, we come from that space, from that place of origin, into the stage of the world to play our individual parts. And we arrive here in a completely pure state. That means pure consciousness. When we first arrive from that home beyond and come into this material world, we have those qualities of love and trust and faith and joy naturally in us. And sometimes small children show this, don't they? You know, before the world has crowded in with making them trapped in the externals, they have a kind of natural joy. A baby sometimes has this natural joy. And in this understanding, we all actually begin our journeys on the stage of the world in that state. But we gradually lose it over time. We may take many births, always as humans in this understanding, but the soul does actually gradually lose its truth over time. And it's a natural process. It's like a battery that gradually runs down, or a metal that gradually rusts. And the beauty of this understanding about the soul and God is that God is an entity who arrives at a specific time when things are getting bad. It says in the Bhagavad Gita something about when irreligiousness and unrighteousness are at a peak, I come. And that's the understanding that I've taken on board now, and I sense it. You can't prove it under a microscope, but you can live it in your life. You can test it out in your life. And I found that it works. I found that when I started to practice the understanding of myself as that non-physical entity who's come from that place beyond, and that my father, my mother, my father, that supreme being, that seed of pure consciousness is actually available for me to connect my mind with that one. When I gradually got this, then it's as if you're plugging your own consciousness, which has lost its power, back into the mains, so that you're putting that energy back into yourself, and it works. There are various things that you have to do to make it work. But it's all, Raja Yoga is all about drawing on this love and wisdom from God to renew ourselves. And on my own journey, of course, there was a mixture at first, quite a battle, and that's to be expected, because we've got habits and brain conditioning that have been acquired with a very different model of what's going on. At least I had. I had that, as I said, I had that distaste for religion, and I was an atheist. I didn't believe in God. But this is not so much a belief, it's more like a reality that one experiences. And it all really does stem from this shift inside in my sense of my own identity, who I think I am. When I thought I was Neville, the scoop-seeking journalist and the striving dad, I suffered insecurity, fear of loss, many negative emotions that were actually exhausting me. When I think of myself as a soul and a child of that loving parent, that I am this inner being and that I have that positive energy, that I have a creative mind, and that bhavna, that positive energy, that those good wishes inside me can be restored when I build them back up through this relationship with this loving God, I find freedom again, real freedom. This is worth having. So really, that's mainly what I wanted to share with you, actually, that as I've managed to partly thanks to this frontier science, this science from the frontiers that I've studied quite intensely in the last 2 or 3 years. And it's really made the penny drop, as I said, that this new understanding, this consciousness-based understanding, really does have logic and reason and evidence on its side. As that penny has dropped, the conviction with which I'm able to maintain that relationship with that one has grown. And so it's like the strength builds inside you much more. And as that strength grows, you see the goodness in others. You don't dwell on their weaknesses anything like the same way that I was prone to previously. Because, you know, when there's a lot of insecurity inside, you put these defenses up around yourself, that you put a kind of iron wall around your heart, and your head develops certain habits, you know, that like attack is the best form of defense. I wasn't particularly like that, not overtly, but there are all sorts of habits of this kind that we develop that are contrary to this loving nature and which cut us off from God. So you have to make a conscious effort to recognize that this is the time when it's a time for renewal of the soul. And when you feel ready to start making changes in your thought patterns and learn about the relationship with the Supreme from whatever faith tradition it might be that you have or that you find yourself drawn to. I had none. And then you start to see that your world changes, your happiness changes, your happiness increases, your relationships become more loving, you become less demanding. Other people find you easier to live with. You know, there's a lot of benefits that come. You learn how to care for yourself actually much better, but not in a selfish way. It's like when you're regularly charging that battery of your well-being, automatically the world around you feels more benevolent, and it is more benevolent towards you. It's some mysterious law, it works that way. So that's the sort of outline of what I wanted to share, and I'd be very happy to take some questions. Have any arrived at all so far, Ritvik? Hello? Hello, Ritvik?
Yes, Neville, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just having a few issues with my camera. Yes.
Sorry.
So I think we do have one question. Is that okay to ask?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, everything that we're talking about, it's really informational, and I really liked how you said about the space-time continuum and how it's just a theater, and there's a home for the beings, and that's elsewhere. So that was really interesting. The question is, how does knowing and exploring about the self, that is the soul, and the Supreme, how does it help overcome obstacles, like practically?
Yeah, very good. It's, if you can imagine the self as being like a battery, I think it really helps. You know, a car whose battery is running low, the lights don't work well, it's difficult for the driver to see where he's going perhaps, and maybe it stops completely. It needs a push to get going, all the rest of it. It's a bit like that in our lives. When we become really too caught up in the physical side, when we, and which I really did, you know, I was living very intensely, but in an ego-based way. It was all trying to prove myself in the world outside of me. And it makes you very vulnerable, actually, because you need love, you need approval, you need that from close family. You become more sensitive if you feel that you're not being properly respected or loved. You're trying to prove yourself, and if you succeed in doing something that looks good, okay, you get a temporary boost, but then soon after that, you know, you'll probably find that you get a setback. So it's a kind of roller coaster ride that can be very exhausting and can actually, as I said earlier, it can make you vulnerable to all sorts of stress-related diseases. When you start to understand yourself as this individuated consciousness, as the soul, and not the brain and the body. The brain and the body being a fantastically complex means of expression for the soul, but not you. You disidentify with the chariot, as it's sometimes called. And when you manage to do that from time to time, although of course you have to come into the chariot, you have to look, you have to use the senses, you have to love, you have to work, but you do it with a certain detachment where you can practice. I think it's sometimes the Eastern tradition pays a lot of respect to the lotus flower. And sometimes this expression is given the lotus life. And it's like you're in life, your root goes down into the mud in the pond. You're not completely disconnected, but you keep your consciousness connected with the sun, with the light above. So you're in the pond, but you're not, and you're connected to the depths of the pond through the root and the stem, but your petals are facing the sky and the sun. That's a very nice metaphor for what happens in your life when you start to become more soul conscious. Instead of being so caught up in everyday life with all its ups and downs, you become more detached, more able to look at it less reactively. It doesn't mean opting out, although sometimes to begin with, you may need to step back from circumstances that just habitually drive you nuts, you know, or drain you of energy. You may need to make a tactical retreat to build up your strength, and then you may go back in. That's certainly happened with me. I left my job for a couple of years. It was about 40 years ago, right at the outset of my spiritual journey. And I was very grateful for that. I left to write a book and freelance for a couple of years, but it gave me a bit of space to start to establish these new practices that I was learning about from the spiritual university. And then I went back into full-time newspaper work, and I found immediate benefits, but it's a long journey as well. And so the more you practice this detached but caring attitude towards life, the easier it is to stay in happiness. And that's very nourishing for you physiologically as well, as I mentioned. And the less likely it is that you'll get thrown off your perch, you know, upset by everyday events. This is how it works. It's I don't know if that makes some sense, but it's extremely practical. But you have to do it on a regular basis. There's a helicopter going past, I think, so apologies for the noise. You
That's
have
fine.
to.
Yes, Neville. That was amazing. And one thing that stood out to me was the fact that you said there's no need.
Sorry, I can't hear actually at the moment. This almost sounds like the helicopter's right outside, James Bond style. I don't know what it's up to.
Okay, right. That's okay. We'll just give it a few seconds. But I was just saying that one thing that stood out to me is the fact that you said there's no need to prove the self to anyone. And the more I'm connected to the self and of course to the supreme, then I'm more and more stable. So that was really beautiful.
Yes.
And in fact, we do have another question in the chat. And the question is from Jazz. And the question is, after a life of programmed thinking by one society, parents, families, friends, world, media, television, etc., where and how does one make a start to unlearn the default position of the mind?
Yes, good. A good recognition that there is a lot of unlearning that has to happen. One thing I'd like to emphasize in relation to that question is that I really have learned that the picture that I believe the Supreme Being is offering us of what has been going on and what is happening now is totally positive. There is no judgment in it in the sense of blame or criticism. I hear repeatedly in the teachings I've been exposed to that this was nature's plan, that we come in that state of power, of self-empowerment through self-awareness, knowing ourselves as spiritual beings. We gradually lose it. That's like entropy, like the physical entropy where energy becomes less available. And same happens with us as spirits, that through our long journey here on the stage of the world, we do gradually develop, as you put it, this sort of conditioning in our brains where we find that we're pushed and pulled in ways that are not always helpful. One important thing to understand is that those habits have usually developed because they gave us something at the time. Like, you know, let's say, well, it's obvious in a sense, you know, I used to enjoy a few glasses of wine sometimes, and when I was very stressed and I didn't know how to avoid that stress, it was as if the alcohol could just give me some temporary break from that. But I found that I didn't need that after I learned how to manage my thoughts and feelings in a more positive way, because of taking hold of the reins of the mind once this shift to understanding myself as the soul had reasserted itself, once that understanding had come. And that's also a part of the answer to the question, that as long as you're identifying with Neville, with his conditioning, with his parents, with his schooling, as long as you're thinking that that's who you are, how can you change it? You can't. But when you disidentify with it, when you learn that you are this eternal entity, that you've come from that one really is like a reference point of everything that's highest in you. So if you keep that one with you, you're going to constantly build your ability to handle circumstances differently, to gradually change the mental programming that previously you had developed as a means of protecting yourself, but you don't need that anymore. And this is actually an extremely important point. You have to be kind to yourself. You are loved by God, and you should love yourself 100%, no matter what has happened. It was your part in this play. But if you don't have that love, it's very hard to let go. If you're beating yourself up about things, you're still in that mindset that you were the one who did the wrong things, who made the mistakes. You mustn't do that. You have to, in order to get this power to do things differently, you really do have to identify with being a soul who is not Neville, in my case. I mean, I'm playing the part of Neville, but I'm deeper than that, and I'm a child of that loving Father. So these are the ways of thinking broadly that allow you to overcome the mental patterns that you no longer wish to be driven by. And a beautiful thing is also that the brain itself is now known to be plastic. They call it neuroplasticity. It changes with every thought and feeling you have. So if you have been habitually, if the soul has been in a distressed state and has habitually felt distressed about things, the brain will actually have wiring that facilitates those feelings. So that's something that you're going to have to change. Because of this plasticity, you don't have to be a prisoner of what is recorded in the brain. As you make the choice to connect with God, to experience the beauty of your inner being, that changes the brain in itself. Each time you manage to have a thought of that kind of positive strength, that automatically starts to change the brain until the brain then starts to help you. So that's why it's sometimes a bit of a struggle to begin with, but gradually it gets easier and easier.
Well, I think that was a very, very interesting response. And I think the question you have beautifully answered, because I myself, I actually teach mathematics. And I think the best way to unlearn something is to learn the truth, or to learn the right way. And so in this case, learning more about myself, more about my inner qualities, the inner being, slowly I can unlearn what I have been learning from the society. And wow, that's just amazing. So there is another question, in fact, Brother Neville. The question is there a book I can buy on the science of consciousness?
There are a few in the pipeline, actually. I know there's one called Consciousness Unbound that is from some scientists, expected out next year sometime. I did contribute to a book published by the BKIS, the Brahma Kumaris Information Services, which is called The Journey. It's called Journey into Inner Space. And that actually tells you quite a lot.
He wrote so many books, you know. What are you doing? Trying this?
That actually tells you quite a lot about the new paradigm and the evidence for it, which includes things like the near-death experience, certain drug trials that indicate that the brain does not produce the feelings of transcendence that some drugs are associated with, but actually sort of shut the brain down, allowing you to temporarily leave the brain. Various pieces of evidence from great writers like Solzhenitsyn and others about what happens when you lose all your desires at this material level. It's as if some amazing energy can come into you, where this power of consciousness to create in the external world what you want from within actually works miracles. There's quite a lot about it in that book, Journey into Inner Space. And there's another one, that's an interesting one because it has some augmented reality features as well. Another one that I would recommend, it's a few years old now. It's called Consciousness Beyond Life by a Dutch cardiologist, Pim van Lommel, who ran a big study, lasted a few years, of the near-death experience. He got colleagues at several hospitals to interview people who died clinically and then were brought back. And he found quite a big sample of patients who had this experience of going beyond the brain, because they were dead for short periods of time, sometimes several minutes. But when they came back, they often described amazing experiences of self-transcendence, going into this world of love and acceptance and beauty. There was one, I'll tell you there are many stories of their experiences, but one that I especially remember, well, a couple actually. One said, I realized that death is just a big, nasty, bad lie. I thought that was really funny. And another beautiful one where the individual went very, very deep towards this place of origin that I spoke of earlier. And they said they felt so much love and wisdom that they said, is this God? And the answer came into their mind, into their consciousness, because they'd left the body. The answer came, no, this is God's breath. God's breath. I thought it was brilliant, that kind of insight that these people gain. That was Pim van Lommel, PIMVANLOMMELL, I think, Consciousness Beyond Life. And there was another one that was just, oh yes, there are some amazing stories around, less scientific, although by a trained scientific mind, was the neurologist. Someone may remember. I can't remember his name for the moment, but he wrote a book about his experience when his brain was wiped out by a bacterium for about 10 days, and they thought they'd lost him. But when he came back from the coma, he had an incredible story to tell. I'll thought that it'll probably come to mind. One other that a book that I wrote myself, which I do recommend, fairly recently published by the BKIS, was I Know How to Live, I Know How to Die. And that has an introduction that I wrote about, it's called The Teachings of Daddy Yankee, the book, but, and it's all about the teachings of Daddy Yankee, who was the head of the Brahma Kumaris until her death last March at the age of 104. And I knew her really well because she lived and taught in London for many years, and I gained so much from her. I wrote this book about her teachings, but it has an introduction that describes the essence of this new paradigm as well in reasonably simple terms. So those are a few examples, but there's more and more emerging at the moment.
Sorry, Neville, is the book that you just mentioned from Ibn Alexander called Proof of Heaven?
That's the one. Thank you. Yes, Ibn Alexander. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, and you can look him up on YouTube. There's a wonderful YouTube video featuring a brain scientist who had a hemorrhage in her left hemisphere. And she described how she also got this sense that she was the intelligence of the universe that was informing the trillions of cells that make up her body. Again, the reference is in that book, The Journey, but that one has slipped my mind for the moment as well. So there's a fair bit around, and if you Google consciousness studies, you'll find a tremendous amount, but some of it is pretty obscure. As I say, I think that introduction in I Know How to Live, I Know How to Die, which is available through the Brahma Kumaris, and that was published by Ocean Books in India as well, and translated into Hindi and Telugu, if anyone was interested in a version in either of those languages.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm not sure if you've already answered this question, but this one's about the consciousness and the science of consciousness. So the question is, how does the science of consciousness fit into the circle of life, i.e. life after death and rebirth, and the merits of what you've done in the previous life?
The size of consciousness?
It's the science.
Oh, science, sorry, yes. How does the science of consciousness fit with, could you give me the question
circle of life?
With the wheel of life?
Yeah, the wheel of life, death and rebirth.
Yeah, right. Great question. The evidence from work especially like Pim van Lommel's, but many books on the near-death experience now, and also past life experiences that some psychiatrists have written about. It points to the eternity of us as souls. It points to the fact that there is no death. It points to the idea that when we go beyond this material world, which pins us into space and time, into the present moment, when we go beyond that with our consciousness, a much broader range of understanding becomes available to us. There's a great book by Anita Moorjani, I think it's Morjani, in which she describes how she almost died of cancer. The book's called Dying to Be Me, and it's a really great book. And she's a doctor. No, she's not a doctor, but she's got an educated mind, and so she's able to write about the science as well within this. But a great image she gives is that because she had a near-death experience, and she met her father, who had long deceased her, and they had a conversation, and he sent her back. She said it's as if when you go away from the present moment, which we're pinned into when our consciousness is held by matter, because we have to be here to deal with the play as it unfolds scene by scene. But it's as if you go towards the projection room of the whole play, if you like, so you see much more. The way she described it was that it was like being in she said, imagine there's an enormous hangar with masses of shelves all around and masses of goods on those shelves and all sorts of things everywhere in this enormous hangar. But normally you're going through it with a torch, so you're just seeing what's immediately in front of you. But suddenly the lights go on and the whole of what is there is suddenly apparent to you. It's not that you're confused by it, it's just that you know the whole of it. And she said it was like that when she had her experience of dying. And then she met her father, as I said. He told her that she had brought this illness on herself because of the way she had been living. She had to go back. She was very reluctant to go back because it was such joy of being beyond. But he sent her back, and she came back and astonished the doctors. She'd been fighting this cancer for 3 or 4 years, but within 6 weeks it cleared. And she's now touring the world, telling everyone who will listen about this wonderful continuity of consciousness and this world beyond. So in the science is not pinned down yet, although there is some good science by he's dead now, but a Professor Ian Stevenson at one of the American universities founded a department that is still continuing, that studied children who claimed to have memories of previous incarnations. And a lot of very persuasive work in a scientific way has been done like that. But what the Spiritual University teaches from the revealed understandings that came in its foundations about 80 years ago in India is that the seed of all of this, who is God, he's like the seed of the human family. And when that seed first grows, as with all seeds, there's a limited amount of growth. So in this recurring play, there's a limited number of actors who come from that home beyond onto the stage in the first instance. And then gradually more and more actors join the stage. And the ones who've come down first, nobody goes back until the end of the play. That's why we've got so many on the stage now, 8 billion of us, because it's been building up and up and up. And even if a lot of people lose their lives, as for example in a war, they will also reincarnate until the end of the play, when we all go back and then the play repeats. That's the cosmology, if you like, of these revealed teachings. But the science can't confirm or deny that as yet. What the science is doing, which is so useful, is telling us that the conventional, materialistic, physicalist model that has been put together by scientists and which is taught almost universally today is wrong, because it misses consciousness out of the story, and consciousness is central to how the play unfolds.
Well, In fact, there's a fun fact that I want to say, Brother Neville. My professor at university, he always says that we cannot exactly prove science, but we can verify it based on assumptions, and we can always check and observe it, but there's no exact proof of it.
That's very
And so
good.
that's one thing I found very interesting.
That's very good. Yeah.
Yes,
So you have to see whether things work for you, don't you?
exactly.
If they work, then okay, you carry on, and if eventually they drop you in it, oh, you think again.
That's right. And so we have learned so much about how it's important to go within and discover ourselves. Would you like to conduct a few moments of meditation?
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being with this chat. It's amazing with Zoom to connect in this way and to be able to share these things. They are of great value, and they're going to be of increasing value too. I'm pretty sure of it. So despite my interest in scientific support for these spiritual perspectives, meditation, as I've learned about it, is really very simple. It entails taking your consciousness within, as Ritwik said. That's not so easy if you're used to being very extroverted, but if you understand that you are not a physical being, the physical aspect of your being is beautiful and to be cared for, this wonderful body and brain, but you are the soul. And the soul is not material. The soul is eternal. It's an energy of individuated consciousness. Quite new for science to be studying this, although spiritual traditions have known it for centuries. So when I meditate, I find myself smiling because I'm connecting with this energy that has lightness, freedom from all the constraints of the world outside around me. It has lightness. And it's good to count your blessings, an ancient understanding, when you want to meditate, because God is on a wavelength, a very specific wavelength of pure and positive vibration. So when I go with my thoughts into that space of self-awareness where I'm reflecting inwards on the soul as the conscious entity that runs this body. And then as the soul, I choose thoughts of happiness and upliftment. I remember that my original nature is to be loving, and that my supreme parent is eternally loving. So with these two awarenesses, it's like the soul and the Supreme Soul join hands, and I feel the strength of truth filling me, not just in terms of myself as a soul, but actually enabling me to embody those positive qualities too. If I learn to do this from time to time, when I have some space in my working day, as well as at the beginning and the end of the day, I'll soon see differences taking place in my life, very positive change. The soul, and God. God is amazing. I'm amazed to hear myself saying that. He's doing this job and calling us, I think now, calling us all home. It's who knows how long it will be, but there's something going on in the world right now that is very powerful. There are dark things happening through deep consciousness that is lost in matter, and there are lights, Diwali lights, burning more brightly that will take us to a better future. So thank you very much for inviting me, and